Tao stood in the darkness of the African night, his massive body completely still except for the slight movement of his ears tracking sounds that carried across the savanna on the cold wind that swept down from the distant highlands, approximately 20 meters away from the three small bodies that were making sounds he had never heard before in his 9 years of solitary existence, sounds that were cutting through the usual nighttime chorus of insects and distant hyenas and the occasional roar of other lions defending territories that Tao no longer had any claim to or connection with. He knew with absolute certainty, the kind of bone-deep knowing that comes from years of survival in one of Africa's most unforgiving ecosystems, that he faced three distinct choices in this moment that would define not just the next few hours but potentially the remaining years of his life. However many or few those years might be for a solitary male lion whose statistical life expectancy had already been exceeded by a full year. The first choice was the most natural from an evolutionary standpoint, the one that millions of years of natural selection and predator programming suggested was correct and appropriate given the circumstances he found himself in through what could only be described as pure coincidence or perhaps fate depending on one's philosophical orientation toward such questions. He could kill the wild dog puppies that were crying in the tall grass about 20 meters to his northeast, their small bodies barely visible in the darkness but their location perfectly clear from the sounds they were producing with increasing desperation. He could eliminate them quickly and efficiently the way any sensible predator would eliminate future competition before it had a chance to mature and threaten his hunting success or territorial control or access to the limited resources that made survival possible in this crowded ecosystem where every predator was competing for the same prey base. Wild dogs and lions were natural competitors in the most direct and fundamental sense of that word, both apex predators hunting many of the same prey species including impalas and gazelles and young wildebeest, and occupying overlapping territories in ways that created constant friction and occasional violent conflicts over kills and resources and the invisible boundaries that separated one predator's range from another's. Adult wild dogs posed genuine threats to lions in ways that went beyond simple competition for prey, employing pack tactics and superior stamina to sometimes drive even adult lions away from kills, harassing them with coordinated attacks that exploited the wild dog's numerical advantage and their willingness to take risks that solitary animals would never accept. More than that, wild dog packs would kill unattended lion cubs if given any opportunity, recognizing that eliminating future competitors while they were still vulnerable served the same strategic purpose that lions served when they killed leopard cubs or cheetah cubs or the offspring of any other predator species that might eventually compete with wild dog packs for limited resources. Eliminating these wild dog puppies now, while they were helpless and defenseless and completely unable to escape or fight back, was not cruelty or unnecessary violence but strategic resource management from a survival perspective, reducing future competition and protecting whatever future offspring Tao might eventually produce if he ever succeeded in claiming a pride and mating with females, which seemed increasingly unlikely given his extended period of solitary existence and advancing age. The second choice was equally logical and perhaps even more practical from a pure energy conservation and risk avoidance standpoint that prioritized immediate survival over any longer-term strategic considerations. He could simply walk away from this situation, turn his massive body around and disappear into the darkness from which he had emerged while investigating the unusual sounds, letting nature take its course with these orphan puppies whose pack had been destroyed just hours earlier in a brutal and one-sided battle with a much larger hyena clan that had outnumbered the wild dogs 3-1 and shown no mercy in the systematic elimination of every adult member of the pack. It was not his problem, not his responsibility, not his concern what happened to the offspring of a species that was not his own and that represented future threats to his survival interests. The puppies would die within a day or two at most from exposure to the cold night temperatures that could drop low enough to kill small mammals, or from starvation since they were far too young to hunt for themselves or even to properly consume meat without adult assistance, or from predation by the countless scavengers who would smell their vulnerability from kilometers away and arrive to claim easy meals that required no hunting skill or risk. Their deaths would happen without his direct involvement or participation and without any expenditure of his energy or resources, allowing him to continue his solitary existence exactly as he had for the past 3 years since his brother Jabari was killed by rival males and the two sisters who had formed their coalition's core breeding females had scattered to join other prides or died from causes unknown. He would continue hunting alone, sleeping alone, defending whatever territory he could claim against younger and stronger males who were constantly probing for weakness, surviving through a combination of size and strength and the kind of cautious intelligence that had kept him alive far longer than the statistics and research literature suggested was typical for solitary male lions who usually died within 2 years of losing their coalition support and pride affiliation. Walking away was the safe choice, the choice that preserved his energy for his own survival needs and avoided any potential complications or entanglements that might arise from interacting with members of a competing predator species. The third choice made absolutely no sense whatsoever when examined through any lens of logic or survival strategy or normal lion behavior as understood by the rangers and researchers who had been studying African predators for decades. He could take the puppies, gather them carefully in his massive jaws despite the risk of accidentally crushing their fragile bodies with teeth designed to break the necks of large prey animals, and carry them to a more secure location where he could provide them with protection and warmth and eventually food and the kind of sustained parental care that would allow them to survive beyond tonight and tomorrow and the following weeks until they reached an age where independent survival became possible. But why would he do such a thing when every instinct in all his training and experience suggested it was not just impractical but actively harmful to his own survival interests? He was a male lion, and male lions did not raise young of any species, let alone the young of a competing predator species that would eventually mature into rivals hunting the same prey he needed to survive and potentially threatening whatever territory he managed to hold against constant challenges from younger males. Male lions and established pride sometimes tolerated the presence of cubs sired by themselves or their coalition brothers, providing territorial defense that benefited cubs indirectly by keeping the pride safe from outside threats. But they did not actively parent or nurture or invest significant time and energy in direct care of offspring beyond the basic mating that produced those offspring in the first place. The actual work of raising lion cubs fell entirely to the females who nursed and groomed and taught and protected their young through the long vulnerable period before cubs reached independence. And Tao did not even have a pride anymore, had not had coalition support or female companions or any form of social structure for 3 long years that had stretched his survival skills and psychological resilience to their absolute limits. Taking responsibility for 3 wild dog puppies when he was barely managing to keep himself alive made no practical sense and violated every rule of predator behavior that governed survival in competitive ecosystems. Tao waited there in the darkness for approximately 20 minutes that felt far longer than any 20 minutes of his life had ever felt before, his massive body held in perfect stillness that was characteristic of ambush predators who had evolved to remain motionless for extended periods while stalking prey or avoiding detection by threats. His body was still except for the continuous slight movement of his ears tracking the sounds of the puppies who were crying with increasing desperation and weakening volume as time passed and exhaustion and cold and dehydration took their inevitable toll on small bodies that were burning through their limited energy reserves at rates that would prove fatal within hours if no intervention occurred. The puppies were too young to fully understand the desperate nature of their situation from a cognitive perspective, probably only 8 or 9 weeks old based on the pitch and rhythm and tonal quality of their vocalizations. But they understood at some deep instinctive level that transcended conscious awareness that they were alone and exposed and that being alone and exposed in the African night meant death was approaching with mathematical certainty. They were crying for their mothers who would never answer those cries because their mothers were dead, killed in the bloody confrontation with the hyena clan that had ambushed the wild dog pack while they were vulnerable during a hunt. They were crying for their pack mates who had fought and died trying to protect the puppies and maintain some defensive formation even when the numerical odds made victory impossible and retreat became the only rational strategy. They were crying for any adult presence that might represent safety and care and protection in a world that had suddenly transformed from secure and nurturing into terrifying and hostile beyond anything their brief lives had prepared them to understand or cope with. Their cries were becoming weaker and less frequent as their small bodies began to shut down from accumulated stress and cold, the biological processes that maintained consciousness and vocalization beginning to fail as energy reserves depleted beyond sustainable levels. Tao listened to those weakening cries and felt something stirring inside his chest that he had not felt in 3 years of isolation and solitary survival, something that went beyond the basic predatory calculations or territorial assessments or resource evaluations that normally governed his decision-making processes and daily behaviors. He felt recognition, the kind of deep resonance that happens when one creature's suffering mirrors another creature's experience in ways that transcend species boundaries and communication limitations and touch something more fundamental about the nature of being alive and vulnerable and suffering in an indifferent universe that cares nothing for individual survival or happiness. He had been alone for 3 long years that had felt more like 3 lifetimes given the accumulated stress and danger and constant vigilance required to survive without coalition support or pride affiliation. And those 3 years had been the longest and hardest of his life despite the fact that he had survived when statistical models said he should have died, thrived in relative terms when he should have merely subsisted on the edge of starvation and failure. The loneliness that came with solitary existence had been crushing in ways that physical hunger or thirst or injuries from fights or failed hunts never were, creating a constant ache that colored every moment of every day and made even his successful hunts feel hollow and meaningless because there was no one to share the kill with, no one to acknowledge his prowess or his continued survival, no one to care whether he lived another day or died alone in the darkness with his body eventually consumed by scavengers and his existence forgotten within weeks as if he had never been born or lived or struggled. Lions were social animals at their core, evolved over millions of years to live in prides and coalitions and complex social structures that provided not just practical survival benefits through cooperative hunting and territory defense but also psychological and emotional sustenance through social bonds and relationships and the simple presence of familiar individuals who knew you and recognized you and cared about your continued existence. Being cut off from all social contact for 3 years had damaged something inside Tao that went deeper than physical injury, creating psychological wounds that did not heal with time the way injuries to flesh and bone eventually healed through the body's remarkable regenerative processes. He had learned to survive alone, learned to hunt without assistance and defend territory without coalition support and endure the constant stress of isolation, but he had not learned to thrive emotionally or find meaning and purpose beyond the basic mechanics of staying alive another day. Every successful hunt felt empty because there was no one to share the accomplishment with or benefit from the food he had secured. Every night spent alone under the vast African sky felt like a small death, a reminder that he was profoundly disconnected from the social structures and relationships that gave lion existence its meaning and purpose beyond mere biological survival. He heard those puppies crying in the darkness, and he did not hear wild dogs who would mature into his competitors and potential threats to his future survival interests. He heard creatures who were alone and frightened and facing certain death, and he saw himself reflected in their desperate situation with a clarity that was almost painful. That recognition, that moment of seeing his own isolation and desperation and loneliness mirrored in beings who should have been his natural enemies according to every rule of ecology and predator behavior, cracked something open inside Tao's chest that had been frozen and hardened over 3 years of solitary survival and emotional shutdown. His maternal or paternal instincts, which had been dormant since the death of his brother and the dissolution of his coalition and pride connections, suddenly awakened with force that surprised him and overrode the logical parts of his brain that were still calculating costs and benefits and survival probabilities. He made a decision in that moment that violated every rule of lion behavior he had ever known or observed, that defied the logic of survival that had kept him alive through circumstances that killed the vast majority of solitary males, that made no sense from any practical standpoint but felt more right and necessary and urgent than anything he had done in 3 long years of meaningless survival. He approached the puppies slowly and carefully despite his decision being made, his massive paws making almost no sound despite his considerable weight that would have crushed small animals if he placed his feet carelessly or moved without attention to where he was stepping. He used the same stealth and precision that served him during hunts when approaching skittish prey that would bolt at the slightest sound or vibration, treating this rescue operation with the same care and focus he brought to stalking gazelles or impalas. He looked down at the 3 small bodies that were huddled together in the grass in an instinctive attempt to share body heat and provide mutual comfort in the absence of adult protection, and what he saw in that moment would be forever burned into his memory with the kind of clarity that only came from truly significant moments that changed the trajectory of an entire life. They looked up at him with eyes that were too young and innocent to understand danger or recognize threats. Eyes that held no understanding that the enormous predator looming over them was supposed to be their mortal enemy according to the natural order and established patterns of predator interaction. They saw only a large adult presence that might represent salvation from the terror of abandonment and exposure and the approaching death that they could feel without being able to consciously understand. The largest of the 3 puppies, a male who was slightly bigger and considerably bolder than his 2 sisters based on his behavior in this moment, actually tried to crawl toward Tao with unsteady movements that suggested he had been walking independently for perhaps 3 or 4 weeks at most and had not yet fully mastered the coordination required for smooth locomotion. The sound that Puppy made as he attempted this approach was not fear or submission or the warning barks that adult wild dogs use to communicate threat presence, but something closer to hope and pleading and desperate optimism, the kind of vocalization that infant animals produce when they believe rescue might still be possible despite all evidence suggesting otherwise. Tao lowered his enormous head, which was nearly as large as all 3 puppies combined if they were stacked on top of each other, and sniffed them carefully and thoroughly with the meticulous attention to detail that predators use to gather information about other animals through scent markers and chemical signals. They smelled of wild dog pack with its distinctive musky odor that was different from any other predator's scent, of milk and infant pheromones and the sweet smell that came from young animals who had not yet developed the stronger adult sense that marked territorial boundaries and social hierarchies. They smelled of fierce sweat and stress hormones that had saturated their coats during the traumatic hours since their pack was killed, of dust and grass and the faint metallic scent of blood that suggested they had been present during or immediately after the battle that killed all the adults who should have been protecting them from exactly the kind of danger they now faced. They were malnourished despite their recent nursing, dehydrated from hours without access to water, and covered in small cuts and embedded thorns from pushing through heavy brush without adult guidance to find safer paths. And they would certainly be dead from exposure and starvation within the next 12 to 24 hours if left to their own limited resources in an environment where vulnerability was punished swiftly and without mercy. He opened his massive jaws in a motion that should have been terrifying to the puppies if they had possessed the experience and knowledge to understand what those jaws were capable of doing, jaws that were powerful enough to crush the skull of a fully grown buffalo or snap the thick neck bones of a zebra or inflict lethal damage on any prey animal he encountered during hunts. But instead of using those jaws as weapons designed to kill, he employed them with a gentleness that seemed physically impossible given his size and the evolutionary purpose of his anatomy. He carefully picked up the largest puppy who had attempted to crawl toward him, adjusting his grip multiple times to ensure his teeth were positioned against the puppy's body without any pressure that might pierce skin or damage the fragile skeleton that had not yet ossified into the strong bones that would be necessary for adult survival. The puppy made a small sound of surprise at being lifted but did not struggle or attempt escape, operating on deep instincts that told young animals to go limp and allow transportation when gripped by what appeared to be a parent figure or adult member of their social group. Tao carried that first puppy approximately 30 meters to a more defensible location he had identified during his initial approach, a spot beneath an overhanging rock formation that would provide protection from above and create a position that could be defended more easily than the open grassland where the puppies had been abandoned. The rock overhang would shield them from wind and rain, limit the approach vectors that predators could use to attack, and provide thermal mass that would radiate stored heat during the coldest hours before dawn when temperatures dropped to levels that could kill unprotected small mammals through hypothermia. He placed the first puppy down gently in the sheltered area, then immediately returned for the second puppy without pausing to rest or reconsider the decision he had already committed to through his actions. The second puppy, a female who was smaller and more frightened than her bold brother, whimpered continuously during transport in a way that triggered protective responses in Tao that he had not experienced since the death of his brother 3 years earlier when his coalition and pride structure had provided opportunities for these instincts to express themselves through normal social interactions. That continuous whimpering communicated infant distress in a language that transcended species boundaries, speaking to something fundamental about the nature of vulnerable young animals and the adult responses they evolved to elicit from caregivers who would invest time and energy in keeping them alive through the extended dependency period that characterized all higher mammals. Tao found himself making soft vocalizations in response to the puppy's distress, low rumbling sounds that lions use to communicate safety and reassurance to cubs, attempting to soothe the frightened infant with acoustic signals that she would not have evolved to understand but that conveyed emotional tone and intent through qualities that worked across species lines. The third puppy, the smallest female who would later be identified as Shadow by the researchers who would eventually document this unprecedented relationship, required the most delicate handling because her body was alarmingly light even compared to her already small siblings. Her breathing was shallow and labored in ways that suggested her physiological systems were already beginning to shut down from accumulated stress and deprivation, and her eyes had the glazed quality that came from animals who were very close to death from exhaustion or hypothermia or simply from the overwhelming trauma of losing all adult protection suddenly and violently. Tao picked her up with extra care, holding her gently enough that she seemed almost weightless in his mouth, and carried her to join her siblings with a speed that suggested he understood this puppy had less time than the others before reaching the point where no intervention would be sufficient to save her life. When all three puppies were finally gathered in the sheltered location beneath the rock overhang, huddled together in a tight group that maximized shared body heat and minimized exposed surface area, they looked up at Tao with eyes that held confusion and fear and exhaustion, but also something that might have been trust or gratitude or simply the profound relief that comes when desperate need finally meets capable assistance. Tao did not leave them there alone in the shelter while he returned to his solitary ranging, but instead lay down beside them in a position that allowed his massive body to serve as a windbreak against the cold night air that was dropping toward temperatures in the range that could kill small mammals through heat loss that exceeded their metabolic capacity to generate warmth. He positioned himself so that his body blocked the opening to the shelter and created a warm pocket of air that was heated by his substantial body mass and the considerable heat that a 500-pound lion generated as a byproduct of normal metabolism. The puppies responded to his warmth and presence by pressing themselves against his belly and chest, seeking out the heat that radiated from his body and the security that his massive form provided against the perceived threats that surrounded them in the darkness. They burrowed into his thick mane and nestled against his powerful legs and positioned themselves in the curves and hollows of his body where retained heat was greatest and shelter from wind was most complete. Within minutes, all 3 puppies had stopped crying and fallen into the kind of deep, exhausted sleep that comes when safety allows bodies to finally release the vigilance and tension that survival mode requires. They slept pressed against Tao's warm body while he remained alert and watchful, his ears tracking every sound in the darkness around them, his eyes scanning for threats that might approach this temporarily established den site, his mind processing the magnitude of what he had just committed himself to and beginning to calculate the practical challenges that would need to be addressed if these puppies were going to survive beyond tonight. If you believe that loneliness can change even the most fundamental instincts that govern animal behavior, that the need for connection and purpose can override millions of years of evolutionary programming when circumstances create the right conditions for radical behavioral change, then please subscribe to Lion King Stories. Every subscription helps us share more incredible true tales from the African wilderness that challenge everything we think we know about how nature works and prove that the boundaries between species and the categories we use to organize our understanding of animal behavior are far more permeable and flexible than science has traditionally acknowledged or allowed space for in its models and theories. The night that Tao made the decision to protect rather than kill or ignore the wild dog puppies was the same night that fundamentally altered the trajectory of all 4 lives involved in that moment of choice and commitment. For Tao, it marked the beginning of a transformation from solitary survivor focused purely on his own continued existence into something that had no clear precedent in lion behavioral literature. A male who would become not just passive protector but active parent and teacher and provider to young of another species who should have been his natural enemies according to every model of predator behavior and interspecies competition. For the 3 puppies, who would eventually be identified and tracked by the rangers and researchers studying wildlife populations in the Masai Mara region as Scout the bold male, Swift the observant female, and Shadow the small fragile female, it was the difference between certain death before the sun rose on the following day and the genuine possibility of survival into adulthood despite having lost their entire pack and all adult guidance at an age when they were still completely dependent on parental care for literally every aspect of their continued existence. The immediate practical challenges that Tao faced in the hours and days following his decision to take responsibility for the puppies were substantial and would have deterred most animals from continuing with an arrangement that made no obvious sense from a survival optimization standpoint. The puppies needed food constantly, not the kind of feast or famine eating pattern that worked for large predators who could gorge on a major kill and then fast for several days while digesting, but rather the kind of frequent small meals that nursing or newly weaned young required to maintain their rapid metabolism and support the explosive growth rates that characterized early development in wild canids. Wild dog puppies in normal circumstances would nurse frequently throughout the day and night for the first 8 weeks of life, then transition to regurgitated food provided by pack adults for several weeks after that, then gradually move toward consuming pre-chewed or softened meat, and only eventually progress to eating unmodified adult prey in the same way that fully grown wild dogs consumed their kills. Tao had to compress and modify this natural developmental timeline because he had no ability to nurse the puppies himself and could not regurgitate food the way wild dog adults did to provide pre-digested protein that was easier for young digestive systems to process. He needed to hunt more frequently than was energetically efficient for a solitary male lion who typically optimized hunting effort by taking down large prey that provided multiple days of food in a single successful kill. Instead, he found himself targeting smaller and more numerous prey species like Thompson's gazelles and young impalas and dik-diks, animals that lions normally ignored as not worth the energy expenditure required for pursuit when larger prey was available. But these smaller prey provided meat in quantities appropriate for feeding small puppies, and their tissue was softer and easier for developing teeth to tear than the tough muscle and connective tissue found in larger prey animals. After each successful hunt on these smaller targets, instead of immediately consuming the kill himself and gorging until his belly was distended the way solitary predators typically did to maximize caloric intake before inevitable scavenger arrival, Tao would carefully select and tear off small pieces of the softest tissue he could find, targeting organ meat and fat deposits and muscle tissue from areas of the carcass where fiber direction and connective tissue structure made tearing easier, and he would carry these carefully selected pieces back to where he had established a temporary den site with the puppies. He fed them individually rather than simply dropping meat and allowing them to compete in the way that wild dog packs would normally handle feeding of young, ensuring that each puppy received adequate nutrition with special attention paid to Shadow, the smallest, who was at competitive disadvantage compared to her larger and more aggressive siblings during feeding situations. The puppies had to learn to consume solid meat far earlier in their development than would be normal for wild dogs being raised by their biological pack, and the process was difficult and inefficient and frustrating for all parties involved. Scout, the largest and boldest male puppy, adapted relatively quickly to eating meat through a combination of natural maturity advantage and his characteristically bold approach to new experiences that made him willing to try consuming solid food even when his teeth and jaw muscles were not fully prepared for the mechanical challenges of tearing and chewing tissue. Within the first week of Tao's care, Scout was managing to consume small pieces of soft meat with only minimal assistance, though he still struggled with tougher tissue and frequently choked or gagged when attempting to swallow pieces that were too large for his esophagus to handle comfortably. Swift, the middle-sized female who would prove to be the most observant and intelligent of the three siblings based on her later ability to learn and adapt hunting strategies, took slightly longer to master meat consumption but approached the challenge with methodical patience that suggested she was learning from observation of her brother's techniques and Tao's demonstrations rather than simply attacking the problem through trial and error. She watched Scout carefully during feeding sessions, noting which tearing motions were successful and which resulted in failure or frustration, and she watched Tao's jaw movements and head positioning when he demonstrated how to grip and tear meat effectively, and she synthesized these observations into modified techniques that worked better for her smaller size and different jaw structure compared to either Scout or Tao. Shadow struggled the most significantly with the transition to solid food, her small size and weakened condition creating compounding challenges that made even the softest meat difficult for her to process in the quantities necessary to support her continued survival and growth. She simply did not have the jaw strength or tooth development or esophageal diameter to handle meat in the same way her siblings could, and for the first 2 weeks of Tao's care it seemed likely that she would die from malnutrition despite having access to food, simply because she could not effectively consume what was available. Tao showed remarkable flexibility and problem-solving ability in addressing Shadow's specific challenges, allowing her to lick blood and soft tissue fragments from his paws and muzzle when she could not manage solid meat, essentially creating a modified version of the regurgitation feeding strategy that her wild dog parents would have employed if they had survived to care for their offspring through normal developmental stages. He would chew meat thoroughly himself until it was nearly liquid, then allow Shadow to lick the resulting paste from his teeth and gums, providing pre-processed protein that her limited chewing ability could handle while her jaw muscles strengthened and her teeth continued developing. Beyond the immediate survival needs of food and protection from the elements and larger predators who would see the puppies as easy prey, Tao faced the more complex and nuanced challenge of socialization and behavioral development for creatures whose instincts and natural behaviors were dramatically different from his own lion programming and experience. Wild dogs are among the most social and cooperative of all African predators, evolved to live in packs with complex hierarchies and sophisticated communication systems and hunting strategies that rely on coordination and endurance and role specialization rather than the ambush and raw power tactics that lions employ. The puppies had genetic programming that made them want to play and interact and communicate in ways that were foreign to Tao's experience and expectations, and he had to learn to understand and respond appropriately to behaviors that made no sense from a lion perspective but that were crucial for normal wild dog development and the acquisition of skills they would need for eventual independence and survival. The puppies wanted to engage in play behavior constantly throughout their waking hours, with each other and with Tao when he would permit it, engaging in the kind of rough-and-tumble wrestling and chasing games and mock combat that built physical strength and coordination and social bonds within wild dog packs and taught young dogs the skills they would later need for coordinated hunting and pack defense. Tao, who had spent 3 long years alone without any social interaction or play behavior since the death of his brother and the dissolution of his coalition and pride connections, had to relearn how to moderate his enormous strength and participate in play that would have been natural and appropriate with lion cubs but that required complete recalibration and careful self-control for creatures who were 1/10 his size and whose bones and muscles were far more fragile than any lion cub would be at comparable developmental stages. He learned through trial and error and occasional accidents that caused yelps of pain or fear from puppies he had inadvertently hurt, how to use his massive paws with extreme gentleness and precision, applying just enough pressure to make play interesting and physically engaging without applying so much force that he caused injury or genuine fear that would damage the trust relationship he was building with his adopted offspring. He learned to allow the puppies to attack him during play sessions without retaliating in ways that would injure them, letting them bite his tail and ears and legs and muzzle with their needle-sharp puppy teeth without responding with the kind of disciplinary swats or bites that would be appropriate for correcting lion cubs but that would seriously injure or kill wild dog puppies. He learned to engage in the kind of patient tolerance and gentle restraint that male lions rarely displayed with young that were not their direct offspring, developing parenting skills that his biology had not specifically prepared him for but that his intelligence and motivation allowed him to improvise and refine through practice and attention to the puppy's responses. The puppies vocalized in ways that were completely unlike lion vocalizations, producing the high-pitched twittering and chirping sounds and rapid yipping vocalizations that wild dogs use for communication and coordination and social bonding, sounds that Tao had no biological programming to understand or interpret at any instinctive level. He had to learn over weeks and months to associate certain sounds with certain needs or emotional states or situational contexts, developing a rudimentary understanding of wild dog communication that was probably unique among lions in evolutionary history. When the puppies made the rapid twitter sounds that wild dogs use to indicate alarm or fear or the presence of potential threats, Tao learned to investigate immediately and carefully, scanning for predators or other dangers that had triggered the alarm response. When they made the softer churring sounds that indicated contentment and relaxation and the absence of stress, he learned to relax his own vigilance slightly and allow himself brief periods of rest knowing the puppies were not detecting imminent threats. When they produced the excited yipping and high-energy vocalizations that preceded play behavior or feeding time, he learned to prepare himself mentally and physically for the onslaught of tiny energetic bodies that would be attacking his legs and tail and face with enthusiasm that bordered on reckless abandon. As the puppies grew from helpless infants who could barely walk in coordinated fashion into energetic juveniles capable of running and jumping and climbing with increasing skill and confidence, their individual personalities began to differentiate in ways that created distinct relationships with Tao and with each other and established patterns that would persist into their adolescent and adult lives. Scout, the largest male, was bold and adventurous and constantly testing boundaries, wandering farther from Tao's immediate protection than was truly safe given the abundance of threats in their environment, attempting to investigate dangerous situations that his limited experience and poor judgment left him unprepared to handle effectively or escape from when things went wrong. Tao spent considerable energy monitoring Scout's exploratory impulses and intervening when the young wild dog got himself into situations that would have resulted in serious injury or death without adult intervention, developing a specific vigilance pattern focused disproportionately on the most reckless member of his adopted family who required more supervision than his sisters. Swift, the middle-sized female, was cautious and observant and spent more time watching Tao's behavior than her siblings did, seemingly trying to learn from his example and demonstrations in ways that suggested higher-than-average intelligence and unusual capacity for social learning and behavioral modification based on observation of adult models. She was the first of the 3 puppies to begin mimicking Tao's hunting postures and stalking behaviors, adapting lion techniques to her very different wild dog body type and creating hybrid approaches that were neither fully lion nor fully wild dog but something entirely unique that combined elements of both predatory styles in ways that would eventually prove highly effective. Tao seemed to recognize Swift's aptitude and motivation to learn, and he spent more time demonstrating hunting techniques to her than to her siblings, creating a mentorship dynamic that was unprecedented in documented cross-species interactions and that suggested Tao was capable of recognizing individual differences and adapting his teaching approach to match the learning styles and capabilities of different students. Shadow, the smallest female who had nearly died in those first critical weeks and who remained undersized and physically weaker than her siblings despite adequate nutrition and Tao's dedicated care, developed the closest and most dependent emotional bond with Tao and spent the most time in direct physical contact with him, sleeping pressed against his massive body and following him more closely than Scout or Swift did when the group moved through their territory. She was the least successful at hunting and the most dependent on Tao's provision of food throughout her development, and there were multiple times when Tao seemed to make decisions specifically to ensure Shadow's survival even when those decisions were inefficient from a pure calorie optimization standpoint, suggesting he had formed individual attachments to each puppy rather than viewing them as an undifferentiated group requiring generic care without consideration for individual needs or relationships. The rangers and researchers who monitored wildlife populations in the Masai Mara as part of ongoing conservation efforts and long-term ecological studies became aware of Tao's unusual situation approximately 2 months after he had adopted the wild dog puppies, when an experienced tour guide named Joseph Kamani spotted what he initially interpreted as a lion attacking wild dogs but which on closer observation appeared to be a lion traveling with wild dogs in a way that made absolutely no sense. Given everything Joseph knew about predator relationships and territorial behavior after 15 years of guiding tourists through the reserve, Joseph immediately radioed the sighting to the research station operated by the Kenya Wildlife Service and associated universities, and within hours a team led by wildlife biologist Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived in the area to investigate and document what Joseph had described with the appropriate skepticism that well-trained scientists bring to reports that seem too extraordinary to be true or that conflict with established understanding of animal behavior. What Sarah observed through her binoculars from a research vehicle positioned at a respectful distance that would not disturb the animals or alter their natural behaviors completely validated Joseph's report and shocked her despite 22 years of experience studying African predators and thinking she had seen every possible variation of behavior that was biologically possible within the constraints of evolution and ecology. A large male lion was indeed traveling with 3 young wild dogs who were behaving as if the lion was a parent figure rather than a mortal threat, following him closely and interacting with him in ways that indicated deep trust and attachment rather than fear or submission or the kind of wary tolerance that sometimes developed when different species shared territory and learned to avoid conflict. The lion was tolerating behaviors from the wild dogs that no lion should tolerate from non-pride members according to everything Sarah understood about lion social structure and behavioral norms, allowing them to climb on his back and bite his tail and steal food from his mouth during feeding sessions, responding to their presence with protective vigilance and patient tolerance rather than aggression or indifference or predatory interest. Sarah began immediately documenting what she was witnessing with photographs and video footage and detailed field notes that would form the foundation of what would eventually become one of the most significant publications in the field of cross-species relationships and behavioral plasticity, knowing that without extensive and rigorous documentation the scientific community would dismiss this as misidentification of species or misinterpretation of coincidental proximity or an interesting but temporary anomaly that did not represent genuine parental adoption. She returned daily for weeks and months to build a comprehensive observational record that would satisfy peer review standards, documenting that the relationship between Tao and the puppies was consistent over time rather than a temporary coincidence, that Tao was actively hunting specifically to feed the puppies rather than simply allowing them to scavenge from his kills, that the puppies were displaying attachment behaviors normally reserved for biological parents, and that genuine teaching and learning was occurring across the species boundary in ways that suggested cognitive flexibility far beyond what behavioral models predicted was possible for large predators. If this story touched your heart, if it made you reconsider the emotional lives of animals and the ways that loneliness and the need for connection can override even the most fundamental behavioral programming evolution created over millions of years, we would be deeply honored if you would share your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed an animal forming an unlikely attachment or showing care for another species in ways that seemed impossible according to everything we understand about how nature works? Have you ever made a choice that made no logical sense but felt absolutely necessary because of emotional needs that could not be denied or suppressed? Your stories and reflections matter profoundly because they remind all of us that we are connected by the fundamental universal experiences of loneliness and connection and the deep human need to care for others and be cared for in return. Please subscribe to Lion King Stories for more incredible true tales from the African wilderness that challenge our assumptions about animal behavior and prove that nature is far more complex and emotionally rich than any textbook or simplified model can adequately capture or explain. Every subscription supports our mission to document and share these transformative stories that expand human understanding of the creatures we share this planet with and remind us that love and connection exist in forms that transcend species boundaries and defy simple categorization or reduction to mechanical processes. Thank you for being part of our pride and for opening your heart to stories about animals who make choices that prove emotional needs and the capacity for love are not uniquely human but universal experiences shared by all creatures capable of attachment and care, and the profound courage required to choose connection over isolation even when circumstances make that choice seem impossible or irrational.